The 1960s were a wild time to be a kid. Toys didn't come with warning labels, safety manuals, or protective gear. They came in bright boxes, promised endless fun, and often hid a little danger inside. Parents shrugged it off, and kids learned quickly that play sometimes came with burns, bruises, or worse. Looking back now, it feels unbelievable that so many of these toys even made it to store shelves, but they did, and somehow we all survived. So let's rewind to an era where fun was fearless and danger was just another part of the game. 1. Creepy crawlers. And what better place to start than with a toy that looked harmless at first glance but carried real heat, literally. Creepy crawlers were every kid's mix of science experiment and art project. You'd open the Thingmaker kit and find those shiny metal molds, shaped like spiders, worms, beetles, or flies. Then came the Plasti-Goop, a colorful liquid that smelled a little like glue. The fun part? Pouring that goop into the molds and sliding them onto a hot plate that sizzled like a stovetop. That's where the danger kicked in. The heating tray could reach over 300 degrees, and there were no guards, no warnings, nothing to stop curious fingers from getting too close. One wrong touch, and you had a burn to remember. Even so, the thrill of watching liquid goo bubble and transform into a shiny plastic bug was too exciting to resist. Kids would line up their fresh creations on the kitchen counter like trophies. Some stuck them to windows, others hid them in shoes or dropped them on siblings' pillows just to hear the scream. They were sticky, stretchy, and oddly lifelike, which made them perfect for pranks. Parents may not have loved the smell of melting plastic filling the house, but to kids, it meant another batch of creepy critters was on the way. There was also a sense of pride in making your own toy. It wasn't store-bought. It was something you cooked up yourself. Every bug felt unique, even if you used the same mold. Sometimes the colors swirled, sometimes the shapes came out lopsided, but that just made them more fun. Creepy crawlers weren't just about the bugs. They were about that moment of danger, of learning how close you could get to the heat without paying the price. And when you finally showed off your collection, every blister or burn somehow felt worth it, because in the end, nothing made you feel more daring than handing a little brother a spider you'd baked yourself, still warm from the mold. 2. Lawn darts. If creepy crawlers burned our fingers, lawn darts threatened something much bigger: our heads, legs, and pretty much anyone standing too close. These weren't the soft plastic darts you see today. Back in the 1960s, they were made with heavy metal tips designed to stick firmly into the ground. The idea was simple: toss the dart high into the air, aim for a plastic ring target on the lawn, and score points. In practice, though, those darts turned into flying spears. Kids loved the challenge. The higher you threw them, the more satisfying it was to watch the dart plunge into the grass with a sharp thud. But the problem was obvious. Not every throw landed neatly. Sometimes they curved off course, sometimes they dropped short, and sometimes they missed the lawn completely and headed toward the nearest person. More than one backyard cookout turned chaotic when a dart zipped past an ankle or landed inches from a bare foot. Parents didn't stop the game. They often joined in. Neighbors laughed it off as just part of summer fun. Only later did stories pile up of kids needing stitches or ending up in the emergency room. At the time, though, lawn darts were a must-have for family gatherings. The clang when a dart hit a lawn chair, the gasp when it nearly struck someone, and the cheers when it landed perfectly in the circle. All of it felt thrilling. What's striking is how casually everyone treated the danger. No one wore shoes half the time, let alone helmets or goggles. The yard became a mini battlefield, and kids kept playing like nothing could go wrong. Looking back, it feels wild that stores openly sold what were basically kid-sized javelins. But for those who grew up with them, lawn darts are remembered not for the accidents, but for the way they turned every backyard barbecue into a game of chance. 3. Atomic Energy Lab Kit. After dodging lawn darts in the backyard, kids of the 1960s could head inside and play with something that sounds even more unbelievable today: a science kit that came with actual radioactive materials. The Gilbert U-238 Atomic Energy Lab looked like an ordinary chemistry set on the outside, but once you opened the box, you found glass vials holding real uranium ore, along with a Geiger counter to measure radiation levels. It was marketed as educational, a way for kids to feel like real scientists while learning about nuclear power. At the time, America was fascinated by the atom. The Cold War had everyone talking about nuclear energy, and this kit promised a safe, hands-on way to explore it. At least, that's what the ad said. In reality, the thought of kids unscrewing vials of uranium in the living room sounds less like a science lesson and more like a hazard waiting to happen. Still, children were fascinated. Imagine being 10 years old, clicking a Geiger counter, and hearing it tick as the needle jumped. For kids, it was like proof of power. a taste of the mysterious world of science. Many spent hours mixing chemicals, charting results, and proudly showing their parents how they could detect radiation with their new toy. Of course, parents probably weren't as thrilled once they realized the set included substances that definitely wouldn't be allowed in toy aisles today. While there were warnings tucked inside the instructions, they were written in fine print that few kids paid much attention to. Most were too busy pretending to be scientists discovering the secrets of the universe. The Atomic Energy Lab didn't last long on the market, sales were low, and safety concerns eventually caught up. But for the short time it existed, it gave kids something few toys ever could: the feeling of holding real scientific power in their hands. Looking back, it's hard to believe toy stores once sold uranium alongside dolls and board games. But in the 1960s, curiosity and risk often came in the same box. 4. Vacuform machine. If the Atomic Energy Lab gave kids the power of science, the vacuform machine handed them the thrill of invention, with a side of burns and melted plastic. This toy looked like something out of a workshop. The idea was simple: heat a sheet of thin plastic until it softened, then press it down over a mold to form little cars, airplanes, masks, or whatever shapes you wanted. In theory, it was brilliant. Kids could manufacture their own toys right on the kitchen table. The problem, of course, was the heat. The vacuform used real heating elements that reached dangerous temperatures. Just like the Creepy Crawlers kit, the surface could scorch skin in seconds. There were no guards, no warnings, and no protective gloves. If you weren't careful, you walked away with blistered fingers and the smell of singed plastic in the air. And that smell, sharp, chemical, and a little sweet, filled the room every time the toy was turned on. Still, the results felt magical. You'd pop out a car body, paint it, and suddenly, you had something no store shelf could offer. Some kids turned it into a mini business, trading custom pieces with friends or using them for school projects. Others just loved the process, even if half their creations ended up lopsided or stuck to the mold. Parents often shook their heads at the mess, but for kids, the vacuform felt like stepping into the role of a real inventor. It blurred the line between play and work, between toy and tool, and maybe that's why so many kids took the risk, burns and all. It felt grown up, like you were doing something important. The vacuform never became as famous as easy bake ovens or model kits. But those who had one still remember the smell, the heat, and the pride of peeling a fresh creation off the mold. 5. Slip and slide. After all the toys that smoked, burned, or smelled like chemicals, some are offered something that looked harmless: a long sheet of bright yellow plastic, a hose, and the promise of non-stop fun. The slip and slide seemed simple. You rolled it out on the lawn, let the water run, and then sprinted across the yard before diving headfirst onto the slick surface. Within seconds, you were flying across the grass with water spraying in every direction. It felt like pure freedom. The danger came fast, though. If the slide wasn't set up on perfectly soft grass, you'd find out the hard way. A bump in the lawn could send your knees scraping, or worse, stop your momentum so suddenly that you slam your chin or elbows into the ground. Some kids miscalculated their run and launched themselves off the end, landing in dirt, bushes, or even against a fence. The thrill of speed often came with bruises, grass burns, and plenty of belly flop stings. But none of that stopped kids from lining up again and again. On hot afternoons, the slip and slide was the centerpiece of the neighborhood. Friends dared each other to run faster, dive harder, or slide farther than anyone else. Laughter and shouts echoed through backyards while kids soaked themselves until the grass turned to mud. Parents usually didn't intervene unless the hose soaked half the yard. What made the slip and slide unforgettable wasn't just the cool rush of water. It was how unpredictable every run felt. One slide might be smooth, the next might send you bouncing sideways. Even the occasional knock or bruise became part of the fun, a reminder of how reckless and exciting playtime could be. Looking back, it's amazing that a simple strip of plastic caused so many wild memories. For kids in the 1960s, the slip and slide wasn't about staying safe. It was about chasing the biggest splash. 6. Easy bake oven. After tumbling around on the slip and slide, kids could head indoors for a different kind of thrill, baking their very own cakes. The Easy Bake Oven was the dream of every child who wanted to feel grown up in the kitchen. A tiny oven, a tray of cake mix, and a light bulb hot enough to cook food. It sounded innocent, but it was far from safe. The design was clever for its time. Slide a pan of batter into the slot, close the little pink door, and wait as the bright bulb inside heats it up. Within minutes, the kitchen smelled like chocolate cake or sugar cookies. For a child, it felt like magic. You didn't need a parent hovering. You were the chef, and the pride of pulling out your own creation made the burns worth it. And those burns came often. The metal parts inside grew dangerously hot. Curious fingers that reached in too soon found out quickly just how much heat a light bulb could give off. Some kids scorched their hands, others singed their knuckles. The cakes themselves were often baked unevenly. half cooked on one side, half raw on the other, but no one cared. Just being able to say, "I made this myself," was enough. The Easy Bake Oven also became a social toy. Friends gathered around to taste whatever lopsided dessert came out, and siblings argued over who got the first bite. Parents loved it too, not because it was safe, but because it kept kids entertained for hours. A small box of cake mix could stretch into an entire afternoon of excitement. And for many, the memory isn't the taste of those tiny cakes. It's the thrill of pulling something out of the oven, still warm, and calling it your own. 7. Clackers. If the Easy Bake Oven filled houses with the smell of burnt sugar, clackers filled them with sharp, echoing cracks that you could hear down the street. The toy was as simple as it was hazardous. Two hard acrylic balls, tied to opposite ends of a string, dangling from a small handle in the middle. The goal was to swing them up and down, so they smacked together above and below your hand in a steady rhythm. When you got the motion right, the sound was loud, fast, and strangely addictive. But getting it right wasn't easy. Most kids started with awkward swings, missing the timing, and sending the balls flying into their wrists, knuckles, or even their faces. The sting was sharp, and the bruises showed up quickly. Some kids wore their marks like trophies, proof that they were mastering the toy. Others quietly hid the evidence from parents who warned them not to play in the first place. And then there was the shattering. Those acrylic balls weren't indestructible. After enough collisions, they could crack and send sharp fragments flying across the room. More than one living room lamp met its end, thanks to a stray clack that missed the mark. Yet that never stopped the fun. The more dangerous it seemed, the more determined the kids were to conquer it. Playgrounds buzzed with the sound of dozens of clackers going at once. You could spot the kids who practiced the most. Their rhythm was steady, the balls moved like a blur, and everyone else tried to copy their style. Parents complained about the noise, neighbors rolled their eyes, but the kids didn't care. Clackers weren't about peace. They were about skill, noise, and showing off. Clackers may have been banned later for being unsafe, but for the kids who had them, they weren't just toys. They were little percussion instruments that turned every block into a noisy challenge. 8. Johnny Reb Cannon. Some kids went for a toy that took noise and danger to another level. The Johnny Reb Cannon looked like something straight out of a battlefield, scaled down just enough for a child to drag into the yard. Painted gray with big wheels, it was modeled after Civil War artillery. But this wasn't just for show. It actually fired small plastic cannonballs. The setup was exciting in itself. You'd load a ball into the barrel, pull the cord, and hear the loud pop as the cannon shot its ammo across the lawn. Kids crouched behind bushes or lined the toy up on the driveway, pretending to be soldiers holding the line. The range wasn't enormous, but the balls carried enough force to sting when they hit, and that made every shot thrilling. Of course, accuracy was questionable. More often than not, the balls sailed past the target and straight into windows, flower pots, or the nearest unlucky sibling. A well-aimed shot might knock over a toy fort or a stack of cans, but just as often, it left someone dodging for safety. Parents watching from the porch sometimes laughed, sometimes groaned, especially when the cannon misfired indoors and dented a wall. Still, the Johnny Reb Cannon held a strange appeal. It wasn't a board game or a puzzle. It gave kids the rush of controlling a real piece of equipment. In the middle of the 1960s, when war movies and cowboy shows filled TV screens, pretending to command your own artillery felt larger than life. It didn't matter that the toy was heavy or awkward to carry. Kids dragged it around anyway, determined to set up battles that stretched across the whole block. And while many toys left behind scrapes or bruises, the Johnny Reb Cannon left something different. The memory of that booming sound when the cord snapped and the ball launched into the air, unpredictable and unstoppable. 9. Water Wiggle. Summer afternoons brought a different kind of danger, one that came attached to the garden hose. The water wiggle looked simple enough, a plastic tube with a cartoonish head on the end that whipped around when the water was turned on. But once the hose started flowing, this harmless-looking toy became a wild, unpredictable snake. The head spun and darted in every direction, spraying water while snapping back and forth with surprising force. Kids chased it, laughed at it, and then flinched when it smacked their legs or caught them across the back. If it wrapped around you, escaping meant getting twisted up and soaked, usually ending in a clumsy fall onto the grass. The unpredictability was the best part. 1 second, it was a silly sprinkler. The next is a flailing whip with water pressure behind it. Some kids even tried to wrestle the water wiggle, only to find themselves tangled up while friends doubled over laughing. Parents meant for it to be a safe way to cool off, but many quickly realized it could sting almost as much as it sprayed. Of course, that didn't stop kids from begging to hook it up again and again. On hot days, the water wiggle turned the yard into a circus of slipping, sliding, and dodging. The hose soaked everything within reach. Kids, dogs, even the occasional picnic blanket left too close. It may not have left burns or broken bones like other toys of the era, but the water wiggle had its own brand of chaos. No one could fully control it, and maybe that's why it was so addictive. Every spray, twist, and smack brought another round of shrieks and laughter. 10. Super elastic bubble plastic. Kids in the 60s could sit down with something that looked calmer, but was just as questionable. Super elastic bubble plastic. At first glance, it seemed like a new way to make bubbles. Instead of dipping a wand in soapy water, you squeezed a blob of colorful plastic
9
goop
Duncan,
out of a tube
1948.
and spread it on the end of a little straw. Then you blew carefully, and the blob swelled into a shiny balloon that looked like glass candy. It was mesmerizing. The bubbles were bigger, tougher, and lasted longer than soap bubbles. They didn't pop right away. Some floated slowly across the room, while others stuck stubbornly to walls and furniture. For a kid, it felt like making your own balloons out of thin air. But every puff of air carried a catch. The mixture inside the tube smelled sharp, almost chemical. And if you accidentally inhaled through the straw, instead of blowing out, you got a mouthful of fumes that stung your throat. Kids laughed it off, but dizziness and headaches weren't unusual. Parents often wrinkled their noses at the smell filling the room, but the tubes kept selling because kids couldn't resist the thrill of creating these rainbow-like plastic orbs. Some bubbles burst into sticky messes that clung to hair, carpets, or furniture. Others hardened into crinkly shells that crumbled when you tried to touch them. They weren't exactly practical, but they didn't need to be. The fun was in the process, watching that little blob stretch and swell until it was bigger than your head. 11. Swing wing. Kids could strap on a toy that looked more like a carnival gag than something sold in stores. The swing wing was basically a plastic headband with a weight attached to a cord. You snapped it on, gave it a flick, and then swung your head in circles to keep the weight spinning. The idea was to make it spin smoothly, like a hula hoop for your head. In reality, it was a recipe for dizziness. The first spins always looked harmless, a slow wobble as the weight circled once or twice, but keeping it going meant whipping your head faster and faster until your neck strained and your balance gave out. Kids staggered sideways into lawn chairs, toppled onto the grass, or crashed into their friends. The laughter was non-stop, especially when one player got so dizzy they had to sit down just to stop the yard from spinning. And the dangers didn't stop with dizziness. That weighted ball could fly off at the worst moment, smacking bystanders in the arm, or bouncing dangerously close to someone's face. Plenty of games ended with someone rubbing a sore spot while everyone else tried not to laugh too loudly. Still, kids loved it. The swing wing wasn't about winning, it was about looking ridiculous together. The commercials promised fun for everyone, and they weren't wrong. It became the kind of toy you pulled out at gatherings, not to play seriously, but to see who could last the longest before stumbling like a dizzy astronaut. Parents might have shaken their heads at the spectacle, but kids didn't care. For them, the fun wasn't in mastering the swing wing. It was in losing control and collapsing in a heap of laughter. And if you grew up with it, you probably don't remember how many spins you managed. You remember the blur of colors, the crooked grin on your friend's face, and the dizzy fall that made the whole neighborhood laugh. 12. Gilbert U-238 Atomic Lab Kit. Now comes the toy that sounds more like it belonged in a government lab than under a Christmas tree. The Gilbert U-238 Atomic Energy Lab was released in the early 60s and promised kids the chance to explore the mysteries of nuclear science. The sleek box came packed with glass vials of real uranium ore, a working Geiger counter, and instructions for experiments that made kids feel like they were unlocking secrets of the atom. At the time, atomic energy was the future. Science magazines praised it, schools taught it with excitement, and parents thought giving kids hands-on experience would spark curiosity. And it did, just with a little too much risk. Children could open the vials, handle the samples, and watch the Geiger counter tick as radiation levels rose. The kit also included detailed booklets about atomic structure and lab experiments, some of which would make today's safety regulators faint. But for the kids lucky enough to get one, it was unforgettable. Imagine being 10 years old, sliding the Geiger counter across your desk and hearing the click 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 rise when it passed over uranium. To a child, that wasn't danger. It was proof of genius. Friends would gather to watch, and suddenly the living room turned into a science lab. Parents, however, weren't always thrilled. Many realized too late that their child was experimenting with radioactive materials at the dining room table. Unsurprisingly, the kit was pulled from shelves after only a short time, making it one of the rarest and strangest toys ever sold. Still, the Gilbert Atomic Lab carried a kind of charm you can't find anymore. It represented an age when curiosity was encouraged with almost no boundaries. Looking back, it feels wild that uranium was once packaged up as a fun gift, but it also captures the fearless spirit of the decade. For those who had it, the memory isn't about danger, it's about feeling, for a moment, like a real scientist discovering the invisible world around them. 13. Sky Dancers. Sky dancers were small, brightly colored dolls with wings that spun like helicopter blades. You placed the doll on its launcher, pulled the cord, and watched as it shot into the air, twirling with surprising speed. For a few seconds, it felt like magic, a tiny fairy taking flight above your head. But the magic rarely lasted long. Those wings didn't always glide gracefully. More often, they veered off in random directions. One second, your sky dancer soared high above the backyard. The next, it smashed into a tree, whacked a sibling in the face, or landed in a neighbor's yard. The wings were made of stiff plastic, and getting clipped by one was more painful than parents expected. Still, kids couldn't stop launching them. The unpredictability was part of the fun. Would the doll spin smoothly across the yard, or would it ricochet straight into a lamp? Every launch brought a mix of excitement and nervous laughter. Friends gathered around, each daring the next person to aim higher, even if it meant risking a close call. Commercials showed graceful launches, but the reality was far messier. Bedrooms saw broken picture frames, yards saw dolls stuck on rooftops, and plenty of kids remember the sting of getting hit by those spinning wings. Parents scolded, but before long, the launcher was wound up again, and another doll was twirling skyward. And if you played with one, you don't remember the safe launches, you remember the wild ones. When your sky dancer shot across the room, like it had a mind of its own. 14. Whammo Air Blaster. After dodging sky dancers crashing out of the sky, kids in the 1960s found another way to cause trouble indoors: the Whammo Air Blaster. At first glance, it didn't seem dangerous at all. It was just a chunky plastic gun, no darts or pellets, nothing sharp. But pull the trigger, and it released a powerful burst of air strong enough to knock over paper cups across the room. For kids, it felt like holding a piece of science fiction in their hands. The harmless idea quickly turned chaotic. Sure, you could line up targets on a table and practice your aim, but that wasn't nearly as fun as sneaking up on a sibling and blasting them in the face from 2 feet away. The shock of an invisible bullet of air made people flinch, blink, and sometimes stumble backward. Pets hated it, birthday candles didn't stand a chance, and parents soon realized this toy wasn't as innocent as the box suggested. The best part, though, was the sound. Each shot sent a deep whoomp through the room, followed by laughter or shrieks. Living rooms, basements, and even classrooms, when a kid managed to sneak it in, turned into arenas of surprise attacks. Kids tested just how far the blast could travel, aiming at curtains, toys, and unsuspecting grandparents sitting on the couch. It may not have left bruises like clackers or burns like an easy bake oven, but the Whammo Air Blaster had its own danger, unpredictability. Point it too close to someone's ear or eye, and the sting was real. Still, no one wanted to put it down. It made kids feel powerful, like they had a secret weapon that nobody could see coming. 15. Vac-U-Form. Some kids sat down with a toy that looked far more serious: the Vac-U-Form. Marketed as a creative kit, it lets children mold their own plastic creations at home. The idea was exciting. You'd place a thin sheet of colored plastic onto a heated plate, let it soften until it sagged, and then use suction to press it tightly over a mold. Within minutes, you had a miniature car body, a mask, or some trinket that felt like it came straight from a factory. But behind that excitement was a lot of risk. The heating element inside the machine got hot enough to scorch skin if your hand slipped. Many kids found out the hard way, walking away with red fingertips or blisters that made them wince for days. The smell of melting plastic filled kitchens and basements, a sharp chemical odor parents could never quite ignore. And when the molds didn't set right, the results were warped, sticky messes that stuck to the machine until scraped off with frustration. Still, none of that mattered to young inventors. The thrill wasn't just in the finished product, it was in the process. Kids proudly displayed their homemade cars or badges, even if they were uneven. Some even painted them afterward, treating each creation like a custom masterpiece. For many, the Vac-U-Form felt like real craftsmanship, a toy that blurred the line between play and work. Of course, it wasn't always safe. Burns were common, and parents often banned the machine from being used without supervision. But whenever the Vac-U-Form came back out, kids crowded around, eager to mold something new. It wasn't the kind of toy you played with every day, but when it appeared, it felt special. And the memory that lingers isn't just of the creations, it's of the hot smell of plastic in the air, the excitement of peeling a mold free, and the small sting of risk that made every piece feel earned. 16. Bop Bag. Kids needed something more physical, and the Bop Bag was waiting. It was a tall, inflatable toy, often decorated with a clown face or a cartoon character, with a weighted bottom filled with sand or water. The design was simple: punch it, kick it, knock it down, and it would spring right back up, grinning like it had won the round. On paper, it was harmless fun. No sharp edges, no batteries, no complicated setup. Just inflate it, clear some space, and swing away. But the bop bag had a sneaky side. The harder you hit it, the faster it rebounds. Kids who delivered a dramatic punch often found themselves smacked in the face seconds later when the bag swung back with just as much force. Many ended up on the floor, blinking in surprise as their siblings laughed. The bag wasn't quiet either. Each thump echoed through the house, and when multiple kids took turns, it sounded like a small boxing match in the living room. Pets barked, lamps rattled, and parents warned kids not to play too close to furniture. Of course, that warning rarely stuck, and more than one coffee table or vase met its end because of a wild swing. But for children, the bop bag was more than a toy. It was an outlet. It soaked up endless energy. You could pretend you were a superhero, a wrestler, or a prize fighter, and the bag never complained. Even when deflated or patched up with tape, kids dragged it back into action. The real magic of the bop bag was its persistence. No matter how many times it was hit, it came back smiling. That alone made it different from other toys. It felt alive, in a goofy way. 17th Thing Maker. On the surface, it looked like a craft set. You got metal molds shaped like bugs, monsters, or flowers, and a bottle of colorful plastic goop called Plasti-Goop. The idea was simple. Pour the goop into the mold, heat it until it hardened, and pop out your very own toy creation. But simple didn't mean safe. The molds had to be heated on a small metal plate, and that plate got dangerously hot. Curious fingers often learned too quickly what happened if you touched it. Even parents who tried to supervise sometimes ended up shaking their heads as kids rushed to cool off burned fingertips under the tap. The Plasti-Goop itself wasn't exactly harmless either. It gave off a chemical smell that filled the room, sharp enough to make some parents ban the kit to the garage or porch. Still, the Thing Maker was a hit. Kids loved the sense of control. You weren't just playing with toys, you were making them. Some kids proudly carried around trays of rubbery spiders to scare their siblings. Others made flower-shaped charms or wobbly figures that stuck to walls and windows. Each finished piece felt unique, even if it was lopsided or bubbled from uneven heating. It wasn't just the final product that kept kids hooked. It was the transformation, the thrill of seeing liquid goo solidify into something you could actually hold. That small moment of creation felt powerful, even if it came with singed fingers and a lingering smell of melted chemicals. Parents may have worried, but kids only remembered the excitement. The Thing Maker turned the kitchen table into a tiny factory, where the risk of a burn was simply part of the process. 18. Fanner 50 Cap Guns. The Fanner 50 Cap Gun was one of the most popular toys of the 1960s. It looked like a shiny revolver, complete with a spinning cylinder and a quick-draw hammer you could fan with your hand, just like cowboys did on TV. The magic, though, was in the caps. Tiny paper rolls with dots of gunpowder that exploded with a loud pop when the trigger was pulled. For a child, it was pure excitement. The sound was sharp, the smell of burnt powder lingered in the air, and a little puff of smoke made the moment feel real. Suddenly, backyard games weren't just pretend. They felt like high noon standoffs straight out of a western. Kids strapped on holsters, wore cowboy hats, and challenged their friends to duels in the driveway. But the thrill came with risks. Caps sometimes misfired, sparking outside the chamber and leaving fingers with tiny burns. The paper rolls jammed, and impatient kids pried them out with whatever tool was nearby, risking another spark. And the noise itself wasn't harmless. Firing too close to an ear left many kids with ringing that lasted for hours. Still, no one wanted to stop. The toy also had a mischievous side. Some kids unrolled the caps and set them off with rocks, lining sidewalks with pops and smoke. Others tossed whole rolls into the street, waiting for passing cars to set off a chain of bangs. Parents complained, neighbors frowned, but to the kids, it was all part of the game. The Fanner 50 wasn't just a toy, it was a rite of passage. It let kids step into the boots of their favorite TV heroes, if only for an afternoon. 19. The Jolly Chimp. This mechanical monkey sat upright, dressed in a little vest with a painted grin stretched across its face. In its hands were two shiny cymbals, and once the key was turned, the toy came to life with a clanging crash. The cymbals slammed together over and over. The monkey's eyes bulged, and its head jerked side to side in a way that felt more startling than cheerful. For kids, the first few claps were fascinating. The sound filled the room, loud and relentless, echoing like a marching band gone wrong. But the longer you watched, the stranger it felt. The monkey's wide eyes didn't blink, its grin didn't change, and the cymbals just kept clashing until the spring wound down. It was supposed to be funny, yet many kids found themselves both laughing and flinching at the same time. Younger siblings were often terrified. Parents remembered the noise long after the toy was put away, and sometimes the monkey would jerk so suddenly that it tipped over, still crashing its cymbals against the floor. More than a few kids discovered that watching it in a darkened room made it feel less like a toy and more like something out of a nightmare. Still, the Jolly Chimp was unforgettable unforgettable. It wasn't soft or cuddly. It didn't fire projectiles or spin into the sky, but it stuck in your memory. Friends dared each other to wind it up, waiting to see who would flinch first when its eyes popped open. The Jolly Chimp wasn't dangerous in the same way as lawn darts or clackers, but it carried its own risk, the kind that made hearts race, not from pain, but from sheer unease. 20. The Hippity Hop Ball. The next toy brought a quieter kind of chaos. The Hippity Hop Ball was a giant rubber sphere with a top handle, usually painted with a silly face or bright colors. The idea was simple. Sit down, grab the handle tight, and bounce your way across the yard, the driveway, or even the living room if your parents weren't watching. The first few bounces were pure joy. Kids felt like kangaroos, leaping higher and higher, giggling as the ball squeaked beneath them. But control was another story. Staying balanced on a round, wobbly balloon wasn't easy. And more often than not, kids bounced crookedly before tumbling sideways. Concrete driveways left scraped knees, while indoor adventures sent lamps wobbling and chairs crashing. The ball itself wasn't always reliable either. Handles slipped from sweaty hands, sending kids flying backward. A half-deflated ball meant unpredictable landings, sometimes folding in half when the weight hit it wrong. And when one finally popped, it wasn't just disappointing, it was an instant crash landing. Despite the spills, the Hippity Hop Ball was magnetic. Every kid in the neighborhood wanted a turn. Races broke out across yards, with kids bouncing as fast as they could, tripping over each other in the process. Some even tried daring tricks, jumping off porches, bouncing down hills, or leaping over friends lying in the grass. The laughter that followed made every bruise worth it. Parents might have seen it as just a noisy rubber ball, but to kids, it was freedom. It gave them the thrill of moving in a way they couldn't anywhere else, bouncing through the day until their legs ached and the ball sagged from overuse. The Hippity Hop Ball didn't just test balance, it tested stubbornness. No matter how many wipeouts came, kids climbed back on, determined to get it right the next time. 21. Chemistry sets with real chemicals. Now some kids turned to a quieter kind of thrill. Science in a box. The chemistry sets of the 1960s weren't the watered-down versions you see today. They came with glass test tubes, burners, powders, and liquids that could stain, fizz, or even spark if you mixed them just right. For kids, it was the closest thing to being a real scientist without stepping into a lab. Opening the kit felt exciting. Inside were rows of little bottles labeled with mysterious names, each filled with bright powders or clear liquids. The instructions encouraged kids to mix, heat, and observe. But let's be honest, most ignored the guidebook and started experimenting right away. That's when trouble began. Many remember the sharp smell of chemicals filling the kitchen or basement as test tubes bubbled and foamed. A small alcohol burner came with some kits, and once it was lit, the risks multiplied. Flames danced dangerously close to curtains or countertops. Fingers got singed. More than a few kitchen tables ended up with scorch marks, and when two random powders created a burst of smoke, the result was both terrifying and unforgettable. Yet despite the hazards, kids loved it. Every reaction felt like magic. Liquids turned colors, powders fizzed, and sometimes little crystals formed overnight. For a child, those moments weren't dangerous. They were proof of discovery. Parents peeked nervously around the corner, but kids stood proudly in their goggles, convinced they were inventing something groundbreaking. The chemistry set taught more than science. It gave kids independence, letting them take charge of something that felt grown up. Even when the results were messy or a little too explosive, the thrill of creating reactions outweighed the risks. Looking back, these sets were less about safe learning and more about curiosity without limits. They left stains, burns, and plenty of frantic cleanups, but they also left memories of a time when toys trusted kids to handle a little danger. 22. The Magic 8 Ball. Kids sometimes wanted answers to mysteries even science couldn't solve. That's where the Magic 8 Ball came in. Shaped like a black billiard ball, it looked simple enough. But inside was a floating icosahedron covered in answers, suspended in a dark liquid. All you had to do was ask a question, give it a shake, and wait for the little blue window to reveal your fate. The first time you held one, it felt almost mystical. Questions flew fast. Will I pass my test? Does she like me? Will I get that new bike? The answers, yes, no, ask again later, were vague enough to keep the suspense alive. For kids in the 60s, it was half toy, half oracle, but the Magic 8 Ball had its quirks. Sometimes the liquid inside leaked, leaving sticky stains on the carpet or clothes. The answers didn't always float up clearly, and impatient kids shook harder, which only made the murky window harder to read. And if one cracked open, the strange inky fluid inside was a mess parents dreaded. Still, none of that mattered. The fun wasn't in accuracy, it was in the ritual. Sleepovers turned into late-night question sessions, with kids huddled in the dark, whispering whispering as though the ball really knew something the rest of them didn't. Sometimes the answers made everyone laugh. Other times, they left a chill, especially when a no appeared right after someone asked a serious question. The toy might not have bruised or burned like others on this list, but it carried a different risk, the kind that made imaginations run wild. It played with hope, with curiosity, with the idea that maybe, just maybe, a little ball of plastic could predict the future. 23. Metal-tipped arrows for archery sets. Kids in the 60s sometimes decided to aim at their own targets. Archery sets were a popular gift back then, and unlike today's foam-tipped versions, many came with real metal-tipped arrows. The sets promised adventure. With a wooden bow in hand, kids imagined themselves as Robin Hood in Sherwood Forest or pioneers exploring the frontier. At first, the arrows were aimed at safe targets, cardboard boxes, hay bales, maybe a painted bullseye nailed to a tree. But kids being kids, the games didn't always stay controlled. Arrows flew across yards, over fences, and sometimes alarmingly close to pets, neighbors, or siblings who didn't move fast enough. The sharp tips could pierce wood and dent metal. That same strength in the wrong place led to more than a few close calls. Yet the thrill was irresistible. Drawing the string back, feeling the tension, and letting the arrow fly gave a sense of power no other toy could match. Each shot carried a mix of pride and danger. When the arrow landed cleanly in a target with that satisfying thunk, kids felt like heroes. When it missed, bouncing unpredictably, everyone scrambled to retrieve it before an adult noticed. The sets also sparked competition. Neighborhood kids lined up to see who could hit a target from the farthest distance, often pushing the limits until accidents were almost guaranteed. Parents yelled warnings from porches, but by then, another arrow was already in the air. For those who grew up with them, the strongest memories aren't of perfectly aimed shots. They're of near misses, arrows lodged in fences, or the nervous silence that fell when one whizzed too close for comfort. The archery sets of the 60s weren't just games. They were childhood's wild gamble, equal parts adventure and accident, with every arrow teaching kids that fun sometimes came with a sharp edge. 24. Mr. Machine. After the danger of real arrows flying across the yard, some kids turned to a toy that looked a lot safer, but still managed to cause its share of trouble. Mr. Machine was a clear plastic robot filled with gears, springs, and moving parts. Wind it up, and he would march forward with a clanking sound, his arms swinging and gears clicking in plain view. For many kids in the 1960s, it was the first toy that showed how a machine actually worked. The appeal was instant. You could see everything inside, wheels spinning, gears turning, rods pushing back and forth. Unlike other toys that hid their workings, Mr. Machine made the mechanics part of the fun. Kids could take him apart, spread the pieces across the floor, and then put him back together again. For curious minds, it felt like real engineering, a puzzle mixed with play. But those moving parts came with risks. The gears weren't soft plastic. They were hard and sometimes sharp, ready to pinch little fingers that reached in at the wrong moment. The wind-up key required force, and impatient kids sometimes scraped their hands, twisting it too quickly. And once he started clanking forward, Mr. Machine didn't stop easily. Pets darted out of the way, and toddlers often got knocked over when he barreled into their legs. Still, the fascination outweighed the mishaps. Mr. Machine wasn't just another toy robot, it was a spectacle. His noisy march echoed through kitchens and playrooms, and kids proudly showed him off to friends, daring them to figure out how he worked. Taking him apart and reassembling him became a badge of honor, even if a piece went missing under the couch or the gears never quite fit the same again. Because in an era of simple dolls and cars, here was a robot that invited kids to peek inside the magic of machinery, even if it occasionally left a few sore knuckles behind. 25. Belt buckle derringers. Kids could turn to something far more dramatic, the belt buckle derringer. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary belt buckle, maybe even stylish for a cowboy outfit, but hidden inside was a tiny spring-loaded gun that could fire a small plastic bullet at the press of a button. For kids caught up in the Western craze of the 1960s, it was the ultimate secret weapon. The excitement came from the surprise. While friends showed off their toy pistols or cap guns, the derringer was concealed until just the right moment. With a quick flick, it would fire from the waistline, sending the little bullet zipping forward. For kids, it wasn't just a toy. It was a chance to feel like a sheriff with a trick up his sleeve, or more accurately, under his belt. Of course, that thrill came with danger. The bullet might not have been metal, but fired at close range, it stung. Kids who were on the receiving end often ended up rubbing sore arms or cheeks, caught off guard by a shot they didn't see coming. And the aim wasn't exactly reliable. Sometimes the derringer fired low, bouncing into shins or high, hitting faces at point-blank range. Parents weren't thrilled when a harmless game of cowboys and outlaws ended with tears. Still, that unpredictability was part of the fun. The belt-buckle Derringer wasn't about long shootouts. It was about surprise, about catching your opponent unaware. Kids bragged about the perfect shot, pulling off sneaky ambushes during backyard games. The toy didn't last long in popularity, mostly because of safety concerns, but those who had one never forgot it. The mix of fashion and firepower made it unique, a toy that blurred the line between costume accessory and weapon.